A soft orange glow bathed the quiet suburban street as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched lazily across the pavement. The air was still, interrupted only by the faint rustle of leaves carried by a gentle evening breeze. Rows of modest houses lined the street, their windows glowing warmly as families settled in for the night. A porch light flickered on, illuminating a small patch of the sidewalk below. Farther down, a lone street lamp buzzed faintly, its light struggling to cut through the growing twilight. The street, usually alive with the sounds of children playing or neighbors chatting, now seemed almost deserted, wrapped in the kind of stillness that signals the world winding down. In this tranquil scene, everything seemed ordinary, peaceful even. But nestled amidst this quiet suburb, a faint, unexpected sound began to rise. It was soft at first, almost blending into the ambiance, but as the moments passed, it grew more distinct. The sound of a baby crying, piercing the silence, carried with it an unspoken urgency. The cries echoed faintly, reaching corners of the street where no one seemed to notice, save for one figure. From the edge of the shadows emerged a scrappy dog, its ears perked, head tilting toward the source of the sound. The peacefulness of the street belied the unfolding drama, as this ordinary evening prepared to reveal an extraordinary story. The stillness of the evening settled over the suburban street like a warm blanket, wrapping the neighborhood in a quiet calm. The hum of the day had faded. No cars rumbled down the road, no laughter spilled from open windows, no footsteps echoed along the sidewalks. It was the kind of silence that felt almost sacred, as though the world had collectively paused to catch its breath. Then, breaking through the serenity, came a sound. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable, a high-pitched note carried on the gentle breeze. But as it grew louder, its distinct tone became clear. A baby's cry, soft but persistent, cutting through the still air. The cries came in short bursts, sharp and plaintive, as if calling out for someone, anyone, to listen. They echoed down the street, bouncing off the quiet houses and fading into the night, only to start again, each time more insistent than before. The sound wasn't jarring, but it carried with it a weight that was hard to ignore, a fragile plea that seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though the neighborhood might remain indifferent, the peaceful facade of the street undisturbed. But then, from the shadows, a figure stirred. A stray dog, its ears twitching at the sound, paused in its aimless wandering. Its head tilted, its sharp eyes scanning the street as if trying to locate the source of the cries. The stillness was broken, not just by the baby's cries, but by the quiet, determined steps of an unlikely protector drawn toward the sound. The night air carried a quiet tension as the faint cries echoed down the street, their source hidden in the growing shadows. It wasn't the kind of sound that belonged in this peaceful suburban neighborhood, a place where porch lights flickered on with a soft hum and families gathered behind closed doors for the evening. The cries were persistent, a fragile melody that stirred something deeper, something primal. They seemed to call out, not just for attention, but for action. Yet the houses remained silent, their occupants unaware of the subtle urgency carried on the wind. From the edge of the street, a lone figure emerged from the shadows, a scrappy dog with matted fur and bright, alert eyes. It paused, its ears twitching at the sound, its head tilting slightly as if it could sense that this was no ordinary noise. There was no panic in the dog's movements, only an unusual focus, as though it understood more than it should. The cries continued, growing softer, yet no less insistent. The dog took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn toward the source. In the stillness of the night, the stage was set for something extraordinary to unfold. But what that would be remained a mystery, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Nestled on the wooden planks of an old front porch, a baby sat strapped into a car seat, its tiny hands flailing aimlessly as its cries pierced the quiet night. The dim glow of a porch light cast soft shadows across the infant's face, highlighting cheeks damp with tears and a quivering bottom lip. The blanket draped over the baby had slipped partially away, exposing small feet that kicked weakly against the cold air. The porch, with its peeling paint and rusted railing, seemed to amplify the baby's vulnerability. No one stood nearby, no comforting arms swooped in to lift the child, no voices cooed words of reassurance. The neighborhood was still, the occasional flicker of a curtain the only sign of life behind the warmly lit windows of nearby houses. The cries, though weak, carried a desperate energy. They were calls of confusion, of need, but the street offered no response. The baby was alone, left in a world far too big, far too indifferent, for someone so small. The porch, once a symbol of safety and welcome, had become a silent witness to abandonment. Beyond the porch steps, the shadows seemed to shift. Something stirred in the darkness, moving closer, drawn by the fragile sound of the baby's cries. An unexpected visitor was about to change everything, though for the moment, the baby remained unaware of the protector stepping into its life. The baby's cries broke the silence of the night, sharp and plaintive, like tiny echoes of desperation rippling through the empty street. Each wail was a fragile plea, carrying a rhythm that grew softer, then louder, as though the child's strength ebbed and surged in its attempts to be heard. The sound traveled far, bouncing off the walls of quiet houses and weaving through the stillness. It was a sound that didn't belong, a heartbreaking note of vulnerability in a place where calm should reign. The cries lingered in the cool air, clinging to the quiet, as if trying to reach someone, anyone who might listen. For those who heard, the cries carried an unspoken urgency. There was something raw and unmistakable in their tone, a signal that this wasn't just a child fussing, but a call born of need and fear. The longer they went unanswered, the more they seemed to magnify the emptiness of the street. The faint cries began to attract attention, though not in the way anyone might expect. From the shadows, something stirred. A lone dog, its ears twitching at the sound, stepped forward cautiously. The cries hinted at danger, at a life left untended and exposed. And though the world seemed to sleep, an unlikely protector had begun to answer the call. From the edge of the shadows, a scrappy figure emerged. A stray dog, its thin frame moving with the weary determination of a creature accustomed to survival. Its fur, once sleek and vibrant, was now matted and dusted with the grime of the streets. The dog's movements were cautious but deliberate, its head low as it sniffed at the ground, searching for scraps or signs of something familiar in the vast indifference of the urban world. It wandered aimlessly, weaving between the glow of streetlights and the darkened spaces between them. Its bright, intelligent eyes scanned its surroundings constantly, alert for threats or opportunities, yet betraying a tiredness that seemed to seep into its every step. The pads of its paws, rough and worn from years of navigating harsh pavements, made no sound against the concrete. For the dog, the night was like any other, a ceaseless cycle of moving, searching, and surviving. But tonight, something broke through its routine. The faint cries of a baby drifted through the still air, reaching the dog's ears like a beacon. The dog froze mid-step, its ears perking, swiveling toward the source of the sound. It sniffed the air, head tilted as it listened intently. The cries were unfamiliar yet stirring, pulling at something deep within the dog's instinct. Slowly, almost cautiously, it began to move toward the sound, its steps more purposeful now. What had been a night of aimless wandering was about to become something far more meaningful, though the dog had no way of knowing it yet. Its journey was about to intersect with a moment that would change everything. The stray dog paused mid-step, its ears twitching as a faint sound broke through the stillness of the night. It stood motionless, its body tense as the soft cries of a baby floated through the air. The sound, unfamiliar yet unmistakable, seemed to echo in the dog's ears, pulling at an instinct buried deep within its soul. The dog's head tilted slightly, its intelligent eyes narrowing as it tried to locate the source of the sound. Its ears perked up fully, swiveling toward the direction of the faint wails. The cries came again, more distinct this time, carrying a fragile, pleading tone that stirred something within the creature. It sniffed the air, taking in the scent of the night, as if seeking confirmation of what it had heard. Drawn by the sound, the dog began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. Each cry seemed to guide it closer, pulling it through the quiet, shadowed street. Its usual wariness was replaced by a sense of purpose, a drive to investigate this strange and urgent noise. Though the dog didn't understand the source of the sound, it couldn't ignore it. The cries weren't just noise, they were a call, a plea that resonated in the stillness. The dog's movements became more focused, its tail lowering, its body pressing closer to the ground as it neared the source of the sound. This was no ordinary night, and these were no ordinary cries. The dog, compelled by a force it couldn't name, was about to step into a moment that would define its life and change everything for the small, helpless being it was moving toward. The dog moved forward, its steps deliberate and slow, each one placed with the care of an animal that knew the streets could hold unexpected dangers. Its ears remained perked, swiveling slightly to catch any change in the sound of the cries. The faint wails continued, tugging at the dog's instincts, compelling it to press on despite the unfamiliarity of the situation. Its nose twitched, picking up the subtle scents carried on the breeze, faint traces of fabric, perhaps milk and something else it couldn't identify. The dog's body remained low to the ground, its muscles tense and ready to react at the first hint of danger. As it drew closer, the cries grew louder, more distinct, echoing off the surrounding buildings and guiding the stray like a beacon in the night. It paused near the base of the porch steps, sniffing the air again. The dog tilted its head, eyes fixed on the bundle ahead. A car seat partially shrouded in shadows, with small movements and muffled sounds emanating from within. The dog hesitated for a brief moment, as though calculating the risk, before taking another careful step closer. Each movement was purposeful, its body language calm but alert, as though it understood that something fragile and vulnerable lay ahead. The cries softened as the dog reached the base of the car seat, its gaze locked on the small, wriggling figure inside. For a moment, the stray simply stood there, its head tilted, observing the child as if trying to make sense of the scene. Then, with a soft whine, it inched closer, its protective instincts beginning to take over. The dog paused near the base of the car seat, its nose twitching as it sniffed the cool night air. It moved cautiously, circling the small bundle while keeping its body low, its movements slow and deliberate. The faint scent of milk, mixed with the unmistakable human smell of the baby, reached its nose, pulling the dog closer with each inhale. Its instincts sharpened, guiding it to the source of the cries. The dog sniffed the edges of the car seat, its wet nose brushing against the fabric where the baby's tiny hand moved weakly. It paused to look up, its bright eyes scanning the quiet surroundings, as if ensuring no danger lurked nearby. Then it lowered its head again, sniffing gently around the child, taking in the scent as though it understood the significance of what lay before it. The baby let out another soft cry, and the dog froze, ears twitching, its body still as it processed the sound. It leaned closer, sniffing the edges of the blanket that had slipped halfway off the baby's body. A low, curious whine escaped its throat, a sound that seemed to carry both concern and confusion. Guided purely by instinct, the dog took another step forward, gently nudging the car seat with its nose. Its body remained calm but ready, as if it sensed the fragility of the life before it and knew it had to tread carefully. Every action was precise, deliberate, and filled with a quiet determination to understand and protect. The dog leaned closer, its wet nose brushing against the edge of the car seat. The faint cries of the baby continued, softer now, as if the presence of the dog had brought some small measure of calm. With a gentle motion, the dog nudged the seat, its touch light and deliberate, as though it instinctively understood the fragility of the child within. The baby stirred slightly, its tiny hands waving in the air, and the dog paused, watching intently. Its head tilted to the side, ears flicking as it took in every sound and movement. Another soft cry escaped the baby's lips, and the dog responded again, this time with a softer nudge, as if offering comfort in the only way it knew. For a moment the dog sat back on its haunches, its eyes fixed on the baby, studying the small figure with quiet curiosity and concern. Then, as if compelled by a deeper instinct, it inched closer, resting its chin gently against the edge of the seat. The warmth of its presence seemed to calm the child further, the cries subsiding into faint, intermittent whimpers. The dog stayed close, its body a protective shield against the cool night air. Every few moments, it nudged the car seat again, careful and deliberate, as though silently reassuring the baby it wasn't alone. In this quiet exchange, a bond began to form, unspoken but powerful, a connection that would soon change both their lives forever. The baby's cries, sharp and piercing at first, began to soften as the dog settled near the car seat. The small infant, sensing the warmth and closeness of another being, let out a quieter whimper, its tiny fists unclenching slightly. The rhythmic sound of the dog's soft breathing seemed to create a strange, soothing presence in the stillness of the night. The dog tilted its head, watching the child intently, its ears flicking at the faint sounds. It nudged the edge of the seat gently once more, a subtle movement that appeared to reassure the baby. The cries faded into soft, uneven murmurs, each quieter than the last, as though the infant had found some comfort in the dog's nearby presence. The stray, sensing the change, lowered itself onto the porch next to the car seat, its body stretched out protectively, remaining close yet unintrusive. The baby shifted slightly, its small fingers brushing against the blanket that had been nudged back into place by the dog. A fragile calm settled over the porch, the cries now replaced by faint, irregular coos. Though the dog couldn't fully understand the impact of its actions, its presence had created a cocoon of safety around the child. For the first time that night, the fragile sound of distress faded into the soft hum of peace as the bond between the two began to grow in silence. The dog, sensing the baby's vulnerability, slowly lowered itself onto the porch beside the car seat. Its movements were careful, deliberate, as though it understood the importance of staying close without causing any distress. With its body stretched out along the edge of the seat, the dog positioned itself as a silent barrier between the infant and the world around them. The faint cries had all but subsided now, replaced by the soft, rhythmic sounds of the baby's uneven breathing. The dog's own steady breaths seemed to sync with the child's, creating a quiet harmony that filled the stillness of the night. Its ears remained perked, swiveling at every distant sound, ready to respond to the slightest hint of danger. The dog rested its head on its paws, its bright eyes fixed on the small bundle within the car seat. Every so often, it would shift slightly, a protective instinct keeping it alert and ready. Its tail moved faintly against the porch floor, a quiet reassurance of its presence, though it never strayed far from the baby's side. In this moment, the dog had become more than just a stray. It was a protector, a shield against the unseen threats of the night. The world beyond the porch remained indifferent. But here, in this small space, the bond between the dog and the baby was growing, unspoken but undeniable. The stray's purpose had shifted, its life forever intertwined with the fragile child it now guarded with unwavering loyalty. The dog lay still beside the baby, but its eyes never stopped scanning the darkened street. Every flicker of a shadow or distant noise caused its ears to perk up, its sharp instincts on full display. Though its body rested on the porch, stretched out protectively near the car seat, its mind was alert, tuned to every detail of its surroundings. A soft rustling of leaves in the breeze caused its head to lift slightly, eyes narrowing as it assessed the movement. Satisfied that no immediate threat was present, it settled again, resting its chin gently on its paws. Yet its vigilance never wavered. It would glance toward the baby, then back to the street, its watchful gaze ensuring that no harm could come to the fragile life it had claimed as its responsibility. The dog's posture remained calm, yet ready, its muscles taut beneath its scruffy fur, prepared to spring into action at the slightest sign of danger. Even as the baby let out a faint murmur, shifting slightly in its car seat, the dog turned its head toward the sound, its gaze softening momentarily before returning to its self-imposed watch. Though the night seemed peaceful, the dog's instincts didn't allow for complacency. It guarded the child with the quiet determination of a protector, as if knowing that the baby's safety depended entirely on its presence. In the stillness of the night, the stray remained steadfast, a loyal sentinel against the unknown. The rhythmic patter of sneakers on pavement echoed softly down the empty street as a jogger approached from the far end of the neighborhood. Dressed in a bright windbreaker, their pace was steady, their focus on the path ahead. It was a routine evening run, nothing out of the ordinary until a faint, unfamiliar sound made them slow their steps. The jogger stopped mid-stride, tilting their head to listen. The faint cry of a baby carried on the cool night breeze, barely audible over the steady beat of their own breathing. Their brow furrowed as the sound grew more distinct, accompanied by a low whine, the kind of noise that could only come from a dog. They scanned the street, searching for the source of the unsettling combination. At first, the dim light made it difficult to see anything out of place, but then their gaze settled on a shadowy figure on the porch of a house a few yards ahead. It was a dog, lying low beside what appeared to be a car seat. The jogger squinted, their pace slowing further as curiosity mingled with concern. The dog's posture caught their attention. It wasn't relaxed like a pet lounging on its owner's doorstep. It was alert, its body pressed close to the car seat, its head lifting slightly as it noticed the jogger. The jogger's heart quickened, a sense of unease creeping in. Something about the scene didn't feel right. As they stepped closer, the baby's cries became clearer, fragile and intermittent, tugging at their instincts. The jogger hesitated, unsure of what to make of the sight. The dog's unusual behavior, the way it seemed to shield the car seat, only added to the mystery. Was the baby abandoned? And if so, why was this dog the only one guarding it? The jogger lingered a moment longer, their breath fogging in the cool air as they tried to piece together what they were seeing. One thing was certain. They couldn't ignore the scene. Their evening run was about to take a turn they never could have anticipated. The jogger stood still for a moment, their heart racing, not from exertion, but from the unexpected scene before them. The faint cries of the baby, combined with the dog's unwavering presence, created an uneasy tableau. They shifted their weight nervously, glancing up and down the empty street as if expecting someone to emerge and explain the situation, but no one came. The houses remained silent, their windows glowing faintly in the distance. A flicker of doubt crossed their mind. Was this a prank? Or maybe the dog was dangerous? They looked at the animal again, its body still pressed protectively against the car seat. The dog's eyes met theirs briefly, bright, alert, but not threatening. If anything, its gaze carried something else entirely. Focus, purpose, and perhaps a silent plea. The jogger took a tentative step forward, their sneakers scuffing softly against the pavement. The dog's ears twitched, and it let out a low, quiet whine, not a growl, but a sound that seemed to say, "Be careful." They froze again, torn between wanting to help and fearing they might make the situation worse. The baby's cries came again, softer now, but no less heart-wrenching. The jogger's hesitation melted away under the weight of that sound. Taking a deep breath, they stepped closer, this time slower, more deliberate. Their hand instinctively rose in a calming gesture, as though trying to reassure both the dog and themselves. Each step toward the porch felt heavier than the last, their thoughts racing with unanswered questions. Was the baby hurt? Where were its parents? And why was this stray dog the only one standing guard? With every cautious movement, the jogger approached the mystery, their evening transformed from an ordinary run into something far more profound. As the jogger reached the edge of the porch, their breath caught in their throat. In the dim light of the flickering porch bulb, the scene before them came into full view. Nestled in a car seat, a baby squirmed weakly, its small hands flailing as soft cries escaped its trembling lips. A thin blanket had slipped partially off, leaving the infant's tiny feet exposed to the cool night air. But what truly captured the jogger's attention was the dog. The stray, scruffy and lean, was lying close to the car seat, its body forming a protective barrier between the baby and the outside world. Its fur was matted, its frame thin, but its presence was anything but weak. The dog's sharp eyes remained locked on the jogger, its gaze unwavering and full of quiet intensity. The jogger took a step back instinctively, unsure of how the dog might react. But the animal didn't growl or lunge. It simply remained in place, its body taut and alert, as though silently assessing whether this newcomer was a threat. The jogger's eyes flicked between the baby and the dog, their heart pounding as the weight of the situation began to sink in. The faint cries of the baby pulled their focus back to the child. The jogger noticed the baby's flushed cheeks, the slight tremble in its tiny frame, and the way its eyes squinted shut with each soft whimper. The jogger's stomach tightened with a mix of urgency and disbelief. How could this have happened? Who would leave a child here alone in the night? And why was this stray dog the only one standing guard? For a moment, the jogger hesitated, overwhelmed by the gravity of what they were seeing. But the dog's steady gaze and the baby's quiet cries brought them back to the present. This was no time for questions. Action was needed. And yet, even as they reached for their phone to call for help, they couldn't shake the feeling that this dog had already done more than anyone could have expected. Its protective stance was unshakable, a silent declaration that until help arrived, this baby was under its watchful care. As the jogger took another cautious step closer, the dog's demeanor shifted slightly. It lowered its head, its ears pinning back ever so slightly, and a low, soft growl rumbled from deep in its throat. It wasn't a sound of outright aggression, it lacked the sharp edge of a threat. Instead, it was measured, restrained, like a gentle warning that demanded respect for the space it was guarding. The jogger froze mid-step, their hands instinctively rising in a placating gesture. "Easy, boy," they murmured softly, their voice barely above a whisper. The dog's sharp eyes remained locked on them, unblinking and vigilant, its body tense but unmoving. The growl wasn't meant to intimidate. It was a message, clear and unmistakable. Approach with care. The jogger's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of the moment. They took a deep breath, steadying themselves before crouching slightly to appear less imposing. The dog's growl subsided, replaced by an intense stillness, as though it were evaluating their next move. The jogger's gaze shifted momentarily to the baby, whose faint cries continued in soft, broken whimpers. The child's small frame trembled slightly in the cool air, its tiny hands clenching and unclenching near the edge of the car seat. The sight was enough to steel the jogger's resolve. Moving deliberately, they extended a hand, palm facing downward, in a slow and non-threatening motion. The dog's tail flicked slightly, a tiny movement that seemed to signal understanding, though its watchful gaze didn't waver. It stayed firmly by the baby's side, its body a steadfast barrier, ensuring that the jogger's approach remained careful and respectful. The jogger's breath eased slightly as they edged closer, the dog no longer growling but still exuding a quiet, commanding presence. The message had been clear: this child was under its protection, and any action would need to be done with the utmost care. In that moment, the stray wasn't just a dog, it was a guardian, one whose instincts had placed it at the heart of something extraordinary. The jogger reached into their pocket with trembling hands, pulling out their phone as the gravity of the situation sank in. Their thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, their mind racing with thoughts of what to say, who to call. The soft cries of the baby, coupled with the unwavering presence of the dog, brought a sense of urgency that left no room for hesitation. Dialing quickly, they brought the phone to their ear. The line rang once, twice, before a calm voice answered. "Emergency services. What is your emergency?" "There's a baby," the jogger began, their voice tight and unsteady. "A baby left alone. On a porch. There's also a dog. It's guarding the baby, I think. I don't know what's happening, but the child looks vulnerable and someone needs to get here fast." The dispatcher's tone shifted slightly, taking on a soothing but serious cadence. "Okay, stay calm. Can you confirm your location?" The jogger glanced around, giving the address of the house. Their eyes kept darting back to the baby, whose soft whimpers were now barely audible over the quiet night. The dog, still lying protectively beside the car seat, tilted its head toward the jogger as if sensing the shift in energy. "Help is on the way," the dispatcher assured. "Can you stay there and keep an eye on the baby until responders arrive?" "Yes," the jogger replied, exhaling shakily. "I'm not going anywhere." The call ended, leaving the jogger alone once more with the baby and the dog. A faint sense of relief crept in, knowing help was on its way. But as they lowered the phone, the dog's steadfast posture reminded them of something profound. That until others arrived, this stray wasn't just guarding the child. It was ensuring the world wouldn't forget that, against all odds, this baby wasn't alone. As the distant wail of sirens broke through the quiet night, the dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move from its spot beside the car seat. Its body remained low and protective, its watchful eyes flicking toward the jogger and then back to the faintly crying baby. Even as the flashing red and blue lights grew brighter, painting the street in waves of color, the dog stayed firmly in place, as if tethered by an unspoken bond to the child. The jogger stood nearby, motioning to the arriving responders, but the dog didn't flinch. Its focus stayed on the baby, its presence steady and resolute. The first paramedic stepped out of the vehicle, quickly assessing the scene, their movements careful as they approached the porch. The dog's posture stiffened slightly, its tail lowering, but it made no attempt to lunge or growl. Instead, it let out a soft, cautious whine, a sound that seemed to say, "Be gentle." As two paramedics reached the car seat, one of them crouched down to check on the baby. The child stirred, letting out a faint whimper as their blanket was adjusted. The dog inched closer, its nose brushing the edge of the seat, as though making sure everything was being done right. The paramedics exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they realized the stray wasn't a threat, it was a guardian. Even as the baby was lifted carefully from the car seat and into the warm arms of a paramedic, the dog didn't move far. It stepped forward slightly, tail wagging faintly, its eyes never leaving the child. A firefighter nearby tried to coax the dog away, offering soft words and a gentle pat, but the stray resisted, remaining just a step behind as the responders carried the baby to the waiting ambulance. The jogger, watching with a mix of relief and awe, couldn't help but marvel at the dog's devotion. It had no claim to the child, no reason to stay, and yet it had refused to leave from the moment it arrived. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to pull away, the dog stood at the edge of the street, its gaze fixed on the retreating lights, its purpose fulfilled, yet its loyalty unwavering. Even then, the stray lingered, its actions a silent testament to the extraordinary bond that had formed in the most unlikely of moments. At the hospital, the soft hum of activity filled the brightly lit emergency room as the baby was carefully carried inside by one of the paramedics. Nurses and doctors quickly gathered, their faces focused yet calm as they assessed the infant's condition. The baby, wrapped snugly in a fresh blanket, let out a faint whimper, its tiny fists clenching and unclenching as if sensing the shift in environment. A nurse gently placed the baby onto a padded table under the warm glow of a heating lamp. The doctor leaned over, inspecting the child with a practiced eye. "No injuries," the doctor announced after a moment, their tone steady and reassuring. "But the baby is dehydrated. We'll get fluids started immediately." A nurse nodded and began to prepare the IV, moving with quiet efficiency. The room was filled with a mixture of relief and determination as the medical staff worked. A bottle of formula was brought over, and the baby, now calmer, began to drink, its tiny lips latching onto the bottle as though it had been waiting for this moment all night. The cries that had once echoed so desperately on the quiet suburban street were now replaced with soft, rhythmic sounds of contentment. One of the nurses glanced at the paramedic who had brought the baby in. "Was there really a dog guarding the child?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief and awe. The paramedic nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of their mouth. "Not just guarding, protecting. That dog didn't leave the baby's side for a second. If it weren't for that stray, who knows what could have happened." The medical staff exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of amazement and quiet gratitude for the unusual guardian that had ensured the baby's safety. Outside, the baby's story was just beginning to spread. But for now, within the walls of the hospital, the focus was on making sure the infant was safe, healthy, and cared for. As the baby was being cared for in the hospital, the jogger sat in the waiting room, their hands clasped tightly around a cup of lukewarm coffee. Their mind raced with images of the scene they had stumbled upon, the crying baby, the quiet street, and the stray dog standing watch with unwavering loyalty. A nurse approached, her expression both kind and curious. "The baby's stable now," she said gently. "Thank you for acting so quickly. Can you tell us what happened?" The jogger exhaled slowly, setting the cup aside. "It was the dog," they began, their voice tinged with disbelief. "When I was running, I heard the baby crying. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw the dog. It was lying next to the baby's car seat like it was guarding it." The nurse raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Guarding?" The jogger nodded. "It was incredible. The dog wouldn't let me get too close at first. It even growled softly, but not in a threatening way. It was like it wanted me to be careful. When I finally approached, it stayed there, watching me the entire time, making sure I wasn't going to hurt the baby. It was..." The jogger paused, searching for the right words. "It was like the dog knew it was protecting someone helpless." Another paramedic who had overheard the exchange joined in. "That dog didn't move even when we showed up. It stayed right there, lying beside the baby, almost like it was telling us, 'I've got this, but now it's your turn.' Honestly, I've never seen anything like it." The nurse shook her head in quiet amazement. "A stray, you said? That's remarkable." "Stray or not," the jogger added, "that dog saved that baby's life. No question about it. Without it, I don't know how long the baby would have been left out there." The story began to ripple through the hospital, whispered among the staff, and shared with quiet awe. The jogger's account painted a picture of a stray dog, whose instincts and determination had transformed an ordinary night into a moment of profound heroism. Though they couldn't explain why the dog had acted the way it did, one thing was clear to everyone who heard the story. This wasn't just an animal, it was a protector, a guardian, and a hero in every sense of the word. As the story of the dog's heroism spread, bits and pieces of its past began to surface, painting a picture of a life once filled with love, loyalty, and heartbreaking loss. Years earlier, the dog had been part of a small family, a young couple and their energetic toddler. Back then, its fur had been sleek and clean, its eyes bright and full of joy. It had been more than just a pet. It was a beloved member of the family, a constant companion to the little boy who would giggle uncontrollably as the dog chased him around their small backyard. There were flashbacks of sunny afternoons, the boy throwing a bright red ball, and the dog bounding after it with unbridled enthusiasm. The two were inseparable, their bond evident in every wag of the dog's tail and every delighted squeal from the child. In the evenings, the dog would curl up at the foot of the boy's bed, its presence a source of comfort and protection. It was a life of contentment, where love and loyalty were the only instincts it ever needed. But life had a way of shifting unexpectedly. A tragedy struck the family. A car accident that left the couple grief-stricken and struggling to cope. The boy, the heart of the household, was gone, and with his loss, the light in the dog's eyes began to dim. The once vibrant home grew quieter, its walls heavy with sorrow. Unable to care for the dog amidst their own heartbreak, the family made the painful decision to let it go. The dog found itself on the streets, alone and confused, its life now defined by survival rather than love. Yet even as the years passed and the hardships of street life took their toll, the dog's instincts never changed. Its loyalty and protectiveness, forged in the warmth of its first family, remained unshaken. Now crouched on a suburban porch beside a crying baby, those same instincts had come to the forefront once again. The dog couldn't explain why it had stayed or what had driven it to protect the child. It only knew it had to. Somewhere deep in its memory, the echoes of a time when it had been a guardian to another small life still lingered, guiding its every move. The dog's journey, from cherished family pet to wandering stray, and now an unlikely hero, was a testament to the enduring power of loyalty and love. Even in the face of loss and hardship, it had never forgotten what it meant to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. This baby had reignited something in the dog, a purpose it thought it had lost forever. Life on the streets had been harsh, stripping away the comfort and security the dog once knew. Gone were the sunny afternoons filled with playful laughter and the warmth of a loving home. Instead, each day became a test of survival, scavenging for scraps in alleys, dodging cars on busy roads, and curling up under the shelter of broken fences to escape the cold. Yet, despite the hardship, something within the dog remained unbroken. Its instincts, shaped by years of love and companionship, had not faded. Even as it wandered aimlessly through unfamiliar neighborhoods, it still sought out moments to connect. A lost child's cry would make its ears perk up. A stranger in distress would draw its quiet curiosity. The streets had hardened its body, but its heart had stayed soft, driven by the same loyalty that had once made it the protector of its family. Circumstances had thrust the dog into a life it didn't choose, but it adapted, finding small ways to hold on to the values it had learned. It still approached with caution, never fully trusting the world that had cast it aside, yet its desire to care, to protect, was never far beneath the surface. It would share its warmth with other strays during cold nights or bark to warn off threats from passers-by who seemed unaware of approaching dangers. Now, as it lay beside the crying baby on that quiet porch, its instincts were as sharp as ever. The dog didn't know the baby's story, didn't understand why it was alone or what had led it to this moment. But it didn't need to. The cries awakened a long-buried purpose, the need to guard and comfort, just as it once had for the little boy it had loved so deeply. Even after being cast into the unpredictability of the streets, the dog's loyalty endured. It was this unshakable spirit that had brought it to this porch, that had made it stay despite the risks, and that had turned a stray into an unlikely hero. Its circumstances may have changed, but the dog itself had not. It was still, at its core, a protector. As the baby's condition stabilized in the hospital, word of the dog's extraordinary actions reached the family. When they learned how a stray dog had stayed by their child's side, refusing to leave and guarding the baby through the night, their emotions ranged from disbelief to overwhelming gratitude. The baby's mother sat in the hospital room, cradling her child close, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the jogger recount the events of the night. "It was like nothing I've ever seen," the jogger explained, their voice steady but full of emotion. "That dog wasn't just lying there, it was protecting your baby. It wouldn't let anyone get too close until it was sure the baby was safe." The father, standing nearby, shook his head in amazement. "A stray?" he asked, his voice trembling with both shock and gratitude. "And it just stayed with the baby? It didn't leave?" "Not for a second," the jogger confirmed. "Even when the paramedics came, it stayed right there, watching over your child like it was the most natural thing in the world." The mother clutched her baby tighter, her voice breaking as she said, "I can't believe a dog, a stray, would do something like that. It's like it was sent to protect her." Later, when they saw the dog for themselves, still waiting patiently outside the hospital, their gratitude deepened. The dog's eyes met theirs, its posture calm but alert, as if it was ensuring one final time that the baby was truly safe. The mother knelt down, tears still in her eyes, and extended a hand toward the dog. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you for saving my baby." The father crouched beside her, his expression softening as he reached out to gently pat the dog's head. "You're a hero," he said, his voice filled with emotion. The dog remained still, accepting the gratitude with quiet dignity, as though it understood the profound impact of its actions. For the family, no words could fully capture the depth of their appreciation. This stray, once unnoticed and unremarkable, had become the guardian angel they never knew they needed. The bond formed in that moment was unspoken, yet undeniable, and their lives would forever be touched by the loyalty and courage of the dog that saved their child. As the baby's parents prepared to leave the hospital with their child, their thoughts kept returning to the stray dog that had saved her. It had done more than any human could have expected. It had protected their most precious gift without hesitation. The mother and father exchanged a look, the decision forming between them without the need for words. When they stepped outside, the dog was still there, sitting quietly by the entrance, its eyes scanning every passerby with calm vigilance. As the family approached, the dog's gaze fixed on the baby, its tail giving a faint wag, as if acknowledging that its mission wasn't quite over. The mother knelt down, cradling the baby in one arm, while extending her free hand toward the dog. "You've done so much for us," she said softly, her voice breaking. "We can't let you go back to the streets. You belong with us now." The dog sniffed her hand, its nose cold against her fingers, and then gently licked her palm. The father crouched beside them, his expression filled with gratitude. "You saved her life," he said, stroking the dog's head. "And now we're going to make sure you never have to fend for yourself again. You're part of our family." The baby stirred slightly in her mother's arms, letting out a faint coo, and the dog's ears perked up, its gaze softening. It took a small step forward, resting its head briefly against the baby's blanket, as though sealing its bond with the child it had guarded so fiercely. The family brought the dog home that very day, setting up a cozy bed in the corner of the living room and filling a bowl with fresh food and water. It didn't take long for the dog to settle in, its tail wagging more freely now, as though it understood that it finally had a place to belong. Over the days that followed, the dog became inseparable from the baby, lying beside her crib during naps and following her parents as they carried her around the house. It had found a home, not just in the physical sense, but in the hearts of the family it had protected. The stray that had once wandered the streets aimlessly was now a cherished member of the household, no longer hungry, cold, or alone. It had gained more than a home. It had found a family that would never let it go, a family that saw it for what it truly was, a hero who had saved their child and changed their lives forever. As days turned into weeks, the baby and the dog grew inseparable, their bond deepening with every moment spent together. The once homeless stray had found its place in the family, and more importantly, it had become the baby's steadfast companion and protector. In the mornings, the dog would lie beside the baby's crib, its ears perking up at the slightest sound. When the baby stirred, letting out soft coos and giggles, the dog would gently nudge the edge of the crib with its nose, as though checking to make sure everything was all right. The baby, in turn, would reach out with tiny fingers, brushing them against the dog's fur and letting out a delighted squeal. The family couldn't help but marvel at the connection between the two. "It's like they understand each other," the mother often said, watching as the dog sat patiently by the baby's side, its eyes full of quiet devotion. As the baby began to grow, her bond with the dog only strengthened. When she played on a blanket in the living room, the dog was always there, lying close enough to keep watch. Every laugh, every stumble, every moment of curiosity was shared with her furry companion. The dog's presence seemed to calm her, its steady gaze and gentle demeanor creating an unspoken sense of safety. The parents often recalled that fateful night when the dog had stood guard over their child, refusing to leave her side. Now, they watched as the same protective instincts played out in their home, where the bond between the two had blossomed into something extraordinary. Whether it was the baby reaching for the dog's paw or the dog resting its head near her tiny feet, their connection spoke volumes, a silent language of loyalty, trust, and love. One evening, as the baby drifted off to sleep in her crib, the dog curled up beside it, its body relaxed but its eyes still watchful. The parents stood in the doorway, their hearts full as they took in the sight. "They're inseparable," the father whispered, a soft smile spreading across his face. "I don't think she'll ever be alone as long as he's here." The mother nodded, her eyes glistening. "He's her guardian angel," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "and she's his second chance." In that quiet moment, it was clear to everyone who saw them that the bond between the baby and the dog was unbreakable. It was a bond born of a single act of courage and loyalty on a quiet night, but it had grown into something timeless, a reminder of the power of love, no matter where it begins. The dog quickly became a cornerstone of the family, its presence felt in every corner of their lives. From the moment it entered their home, it seemed to understand its role, not just as a pet, but as a protector, a guardian, and a loyal companion. As the baby grew, the dog's devotion never wavered. In fact, it deepened with time. When the baby took her first wobbly steps, the dog was right there beside her, its steady frame a support she instinctively reached for. Her tiny fingers gripped its fur as she found her balance, and the dog stood still, patient and gentle, as though it understood the importance of the milestone. Every giggle, every stumble, every squeal of delight was shared with the dog, who remained her constant shadow. During playtime, the dog would sit nearby, watching over her with unwavering focus. It would gently nudge her blocks back toward her when they rolled too far, or lie down beside her, its head resting on its paws, content to simply be near. The parents often joked that the dog was more attentive than any babysitter could ever be. As the baby grew into a toddler, their bond only strengthened. The dog would follow her wherever she went, from the backyard to the living room, always keeping her within sight. If she ventured too close to something unsafe, the dog would bark softly, alerting her parents with a protective instinct that had become second nature. At night, the dog would curl up just outside her room, its ears twitching at every sound. Even in sleep, it seemed attuned to her, ready to spring into action if needed. The family often found her early in the morning, sitting beside the dog on the living room floor, her tiny hands stroking its fur as she whispered her secrets to her ever-loyal friend. The dog wasn't just a part of the family, it was a pillar of it. It played, it protected, and it loved with a quiet intensity that touched everyone in the household. For the parents, the dog's presence was a constant source of reassurance. For the baby, it was a steadfast companion, her first friend and her fiercest protector. Years later, as the baby grew into a child and the dog's fur began to gray, their bond remained as strong as ever. The family often looked back on that night, the night the dog had found their daughter and refused to leave her side. That single act of bravery had forged a connection that would last a lifetime, turning a stray dog into an irreplaceable part of their family's story. As the years passed, the story of the stray dog and the baby became a cherished memory, one the family often retold with awe and gratitude. It was a tale of courage, loyalty, and the unspoken connection that had forever changed their lives. The dog, once a lonely wanderer on the streets, had found not only a home but a purpose, and in doing so, had brought a kind of love and protection that words could hardly capture. Sitting in the backyard one sunny afternoon, the family watched as their daughter, now older and full of energy, played with the dog. The two were inseparable, their bond unshaken by time. The girl threw a ball, and though the dog's movements had slowed with age, it still bounded after it with the same eagerness it had shown from the start. Her laughter filled the air, a sound that seemed to echo the joy and trust they had built together over the years. The parents exchanged a glance, their expressions soft and reflective. Who would have thought that a stray dog of all things would become such an important part of our lives? The father said, his voice full of admiration. The mother nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. It's like he was meant to find her, to find us. We saved him, but he saved us first. The dog, now resting at the girl's feet, lifted its head at the sound of their voices, its bright eyes still filled with the same quiet devotion that had brought it to their doorstep that fateful night. The family often marveled at the depth of the bond they shared with the dog, a bond that transcended words, built on trust, love, and the simple but profound act of being there for one another. In the quiet moments, they would reflect on what the dog had taught them. That loyalty doesn't require words, that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the smallest gestures, like refusing to leave a crying baby's side, can have the greatest impact. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the backyard in a warm golden glow, the girl crouched beside her companion, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck in a gentle hug. It rested its head against her, a picture of contentment. In that moment, it was clear that their bond was unbreakable, a testament to the extraordinary connection between humans and animals. The story had begun with an act of protection, a stray dog answering a baby's cries in the stillness of the night. It ended with a family forever changed, their lives intertwined by love, loyalty, and the timeless reminder that sometimes the most profound heroes are the ones who walk on four legs,